Hey y'all, welcome back to Mum. I'm your host, Ellen Wong. Today's conversation is about disenfranchised grief. It's a different kind of grief. And disenfranchised grief is when your grief is not recognized or honored by your community. I think it's really difficult already to feel that loss and everything that comes with loss of a dear soul, a dear person, somebody who's really close to you or somebody that means a lot to you. But when that relationship, I should say, is not validated by your community, it brings in a whole other element that is so challenging and difficult. Do you deserve to grieve? Do you deserve to feel the depth of your feelings for this person or about this person, about their death? Today's guest is Nelly Reznik. She's a Soviet-born psychic medium and spiritual teacher living in Brooklyn. And she's somebody that I actually studied mediumship with and is a fantastic teacher for any of y'all out there who are interested in either psychic development or mediumship. And she tells us her story today, starting with the story of her grandparents surviving multiple Holocausts, specifically her grandfather. And then we get into a really interesting conversation about a coworker of hers that was actually more than a coworker. And there was a budding romance, a budding relationship between them when he suddenly died. And so I found this conversation so relevant, so moving, and just it's a part of grief or a side of grief that I don't think we often talk about. You know, I find myself in a lot of spaces where we are we're learning how to embody that grief and express that grief and allow that energy to move through us. But I think when it's not validated, when that energy or that emotion, that experience isn't validated by our loved ones or our communities, our colleagues, it's really hard to allow that energy to be fully expressed. I think the natural, very human thing to do is to actually hide it and suppress it for fear of what others may think or say. And so this is a really important conversation. I think that many of us may have actually experienced. We have a whole community of people, the Black community, that experiences disenfranchised grief all the time, especially because of all the murders that occur within their community by law enforcement. That is a form of disenfranchised grief too. And so this is a really important topic, a really important side of grief that I think we need to address. So I invite you to prepare yourself to receive this conversation. Feel your feet planted on the earth. Feel the weight of your body where you're sitting. Taking in a deep breath in through your nose. And gently sighing that breath out. Giving yourself permission to sink back into the earth a little bit more. It's my honor to introduce Nelly. You really popped into my heart a couple of months ago, and I was like, man, I really need to have Nelly on and to talk about just your experience as a medium, really. But what I'm really grateful for this particular conversation today is to actually hear a little bit about how you even came into your gifts, which I feel like it's always through a wound. Like we always
hmm
discover these things about ourselves through these wounds. And so, yeah, I'm gonna let you start wherever you want to start, and like,
Okay.
I'll turn it over to you because I think that might actually be better.
Yeah. Well, I want to start by saying I'm so happy to be here. That's like the first and last positive thing I'll say throughout this whole time. I'm just like not a positive person, you know? But like, it's funny because when you ask me that question, my instinct is to kind of give my like little elevator pitch that I always give because
Hmm.
I was telling you this earlier, but like I think when you do this work, a part of you sort of shuts down because people want to know, but they don't really want to know. And when people ask, sometimes like you'll have a conversation with someone and you think you're having a normal conversation, and then you find out later they were sort of testing you because there's so much mistrust around mediums and mediumship. Had someone book a reading with me and I'd had a conversation with her like, you know, socially or like a while back and she was like, yeah, like I was talking to you and I was like looking for bullshit and I couldn't find any. And then, and I'm like, okay, great way to start a reading,
I
you
know.
know?
What are you supposed to do with that?
And like
Think.
so many people are like that. So I think as mediums, like I'll speak for myself, but I think it's prevalent in the if you want to call it we call things communities that really aren't communities, but sort of just a bunch of people doing similar things. I feel like it's really sort of rampant in our community of this just sort of like, why do you want to know? So
Mm.
plus I come from the Soviet Union. I was born in the Soviet Union, and so the one clearly I'm stalling, but it's fine. But I was telling someone yesterday, I'm like, my mother has only given me like one piece of wisdom besides where to buy shoes or whatever. And it was in the form of like this was like more than 10 years ago. Trying to I was applying for jobs and I was trying to practice for an interview and she was helping me practice and she asked me a question and I answered it for a little while. And then I was like, is that good? Is that enough? Should I say more? She goes, no, don't say more. Don't volunteer information about yourself. You're from Soviet Union. You should know this. So, so I feel like I've learned from different avenues to sort of not reveal things about myself, but like pretend like I am. So yeah, but this journey started for me. I think my elevator pitch will start there, that I'll deconstruct it. Maybe that's what we'll do. Christ. Um is I'm always like, well, I feel that I was always able to do this as a child, but I didn't realize it until like 9 years ago when someone close to me passed away. And it was through the grief process that I started to, be able to understand what was happening and take classes. And now I do it professionally. Isn't that great? It's so neat and clean. Like, oh, that's it. That's all that happened. Um, but no, yeah, the way that it happened kind of deliberately is that at this point, almost 9 years ago,
Mhm.
a close friend of mine passed away. And it was a really traumatic event for me for a lot of reasons. Obviously, the death itself,
Mhm.
but also all the circumstances surrounding it. So this was a person who um we had known each other for a little while, but he wasn't like an old friend. We worked together. So we worked together in a really close environment. That I think is hard to explain to people who work in like a normal office. This was like sort of a nonprofit startup situation. We were all young. I wasn't making any money because I was doing AmeriCorps Vista where you make like $10,000 a year and it's horrifying. So that's another. I have financial trauma too. Shout out to financial trauma. Anyway, what I'm saying is that I had nothing else going for me. So it just made it worse, you know? But like yeah, so we were in close proximity every day. I think it's fun. I'm kind of going all over the place with this story that I have barely started, but it's like when he died, I would describe it to people as like my coworker died,
Mhm.
and I couldn't understand in my like grief and confusion and just absolute just nonsense brain that was happening after someone dies. You're just full of nonsense why people weren't understanding, like why that was so traumatic. And it's like
Mhm.
because you see your coworkers every day, but also it was like a joke gone wrong, where at the time Brooklyn Nine-Nine was on the air, and um, yeah, I used to listen to Chelsea Peretti's podcast where she would joke, she would call close friends of hers like my dear, dear coworker. And
Uh-huh.
it was just like really funny coming from her because and she would like crack herself up. So I just kind of stole it from her. So I would call Frank, I'd be like, you're my dear acquaintance, like you're my dear coworker. And he'd get a little bit not mad, but just a little, he's like, you're more than a coworker, you know? And I'd gotten so used to calling him my coworker as a joke that when
Hmm.
he died, I just continued calling him my coworker and like crying, and people would were I think we're envisioning like an old man, or
Hmm.
something that like I mean that's sad. That would be sad too, but like not like someone my own age. I mean, we were like 28, and someone that was like the main person in my life in a
Yeah.
way. Um, and I
Well,
just
you
like
probably see him so much more than family, even
exactly.
friends, because it's like he's like a fixture in your daily life.
Totally. Like he was the person that, 'cause I was thinking about this, it's like once, and I didn't, it started happening without me realizing it, where something would happen, I'd be like, oh, I can't wait to tell Frank tomorrow. Like
Mm.
something dumb happens on the train. I'm like, oh, Frank is gonna laugh. And it was just so different from any other way that I had approached any kind of like romantic relationship prior to that. Also, I had rejected him romantically in the past, but we're not going to talk about that. No, no, we can talk about it. But like and then that was, it's like one of these things that like if he had lived and then things would have happened, it would have been like a cute story to tell our kids later.
Yeah.
And instead he just like died. What a fuck up, right? But like so um
Well, it's like it's striking me that in his death was all the like storylines or possibilities that could have been, right? So it's almost like, yeah, I feel like it's almost like an unwritten book in a sense, where you're sort of like you have the first
completely.
chapter or two chapters in and then it's gone. It's like nothing.
It's a very particular kind of grief that I think I didn't understand or couldn't understand after he died. And I have this thing about like not wanting to be dramatic or not wanting to blow things out of proportion. Not that you can blow somebody's death out of proportion. It's obviously horrific what happened. But um, I think like having been raised in this way where so my grandparents are Holocaust survivors, and like we came to the United States as refugees when I was 2 years old. I was born in Latvia, which was the Soviet Union at the time, as I've said 50 times. I will I really talk about like I only talk about the Soviet Union and the Holocaust, and like that's it. But and so I feel like things, and obviously I'm thinking about this a lot lately because there's multiple genocides happening now, but
Mhm.
the way that things get normalized to you as a kid. And I think this has to do with my mediumship too, where I've been thinking about how growing up, like I would look at, like my grandfather had a bullet wound on his leg from the Shoah because he wasn't in the camps. That's like a very sort of like a Western Europe or German lens.
Mhm. Mhm.
He had survived in Ukraine. So most of the Holocaust actually happened around like Ukraine, Poland, certain parts of Western Russia, Hungary. Um, and most of the 6 million Jews who would have been killed in the Holocaust had already been killed by the time it got more west and got into the
Mhm.
camps.
Mhm.
So my grandfather survived actually two separate genocides by the time he was 17. So the first was Holodomor, which was the Stalin made man-made famine in Ukraine. Um, and so that was when he was 8 years old and he lost his father.
Mhm.
And then with the actual Holocaust, I'll keep the story brief because it's very long and super fucked. But
Mhm.
um, he basically, it's when they were just kind of shooting people into ditches. Um, so after the Russians invaded, the Germans invaded. Um, and he the I guess I'll just tell you the whole
Yeah.
main story.
Yeah.
Like I'm like, why am I holding back? But so the Jews were kind of like lied to, put into ghettos, kind of moved around, similar to what's happening in Gaza now. Um, and um, and then when the Jews would arrive, or they'd kind of heard them, then they would just start shooting them into ditches systematically. So Babin Yar, which is not what my grandfather survived, but that's a site that actually started getting bombed by Russia a couple of years ago in the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Babin Yar, that was a site where about 33,000 people, most of them Jews, were shot into a ravine within the span of 2 days.
Oh,
Um, and so I think that was around 1941, if I'm not mistaken. But kind of around that time period, there were like different sites where that was happening, Babin Yar being maybe the most famous. But where my grandfather was, I believe it was in like Western Ukraine somewhere, and in a Pale of Settlement stuff. I'm not sure, but um he was separated from his mother and sister, and his sister, I think, was actually like visiting home from the institute or whatever that she was at.
mm,
And my grandfather was, I believe, 14 or 15 at the time. And so they were, yeah, they were kind of like in this area. They'd been told to bring all their stuff with them so that they could relocate them, but then not that they had a lot of things, but then the things were taken from them. And somebody asked my grandpa, or somebody asked, like, can somebody, is somebody good with like horses or something? So my
mm,
grandfather went and did that for a little bit. For this is all in the span of like a few hours. So he was like on the bottom of the hill or whatever, and his mother and sister were separated, and um, they were just shooting people into like ditches that they had already dug or into a ravine or something. And my grandfather said, like, wherever they were, which was kind of very nearby, the people were like, oh, they're shooting people. And then they're like, no, they're not. They wouldn't, and but they were. And by the time they got to my grandpa, he was one of the last people. It was kind of like the end of the line, and he was near this woman and her son, and everybody was like basically naked. Um, or half naked or whatever. And it was like, I believe, November. Um, and the woman sees my grandfather, and she's like, so the woman is kissing and hugging her son, saying goodbye to him. She sees my grandfather and says, "Boy, why are you alone?" And he says to her, "Well, I got separated from my mother and sister." And she said, "Well, okay, now I have two sons."
mm,
And when they got to kind of where the three of where they were, I am not sure exactly what happened, but basically they shot the woman, and as she was falling back, she kind of hit my grandpa and made it so that he fell back with her.
mm.
So they thought that they had shot my grandfather, but
Wow.
they'd missed.
Oh,
And then
no.
when he was in the ditch, he had to sort of like cover himself in bodies and in blood, so he was just playing dead, but they were shooting into the ditch to make sure that they got everybody. And I think that was when they got his leg. And then after after that, so they were packing in the dirt, and I think he overheard them saying, like, like, oh, it's late, like maybe it's okay if we don't like fully, bury these bodies. And so because of that, he wasn't buried alive. Um,
Wow.
and at some point he fainted or got in a coma. There's certain details I'm a little hazy on, although it's like written, but it's it's a long at some point in the story too after this he's like, and that's when the trouble started. I'm like, what? um
Oh my
it's
God.
like when he got to the hospital. um but he had, I think this part is interesting because it's about mutual aid. But he somehow ended up at this person's house. It's this Greek man who my grandpa had helped out before because the Nazis had tr burned down or tried to burn down that village previously, and my grandpa had helped the guy get his stuff or something like that. So
Mm,
the guy took him in and was like, "Okay, this is what happened to you. You're not a Jew." Because my grandpa didn't have any papers.
right.
So the guy was like, "You're not a Jew, you're Greek or something. You were on a boat. You're from a boat family. Your family sails. Your family had a boat. It sank. Everyone died. Whoopsie. So you're gonna go to the government people and be like, my name is this other name, and
Wow. So he gave him a
give
whole
me,
story to like
yeah,
a
whole
whole
backstory."
backstory. Wow.
And my grandpa arrived somehow, got and then he had to like get out of there like that night, and then he like got to some hospital, and it's like, Ukrainian hospital in like the 1940s. It's not like great. Um, and this, I'm pretty sure this happened. So he was in a coma for a little while, and when he was in a coma, I don't even know if this is possible, but he was, kind of know how comas work, but he was like babbling.
Hmm.
And when he kind of like came to, they were like, "Are you Jewish? Because was that Yiddish that you were speaking?" He goes, "No, I only speak one language. I only speak Russian." And that's how he stopped speaking Yiddish,
Wow.
which is a dying language. And yeah, I think there was like a spy. Yeah, that's when he was like, and that's when the trouble started because they were like going to amputate him, and some nurse was like, "It's better if he dies than if he's amputated," because that was true at the time.
Oh,
So he
wow.
kept
Mhm.
his leg, and then he like found a farm to, he had to leave the hospital at some point because that was no longer safe. So then he found a farm to work at, and like, yeah, speaking of psychic ability too, or whatever, it's like he said a name. They asked him what his name was. He made up
Mhm.
some random name. It was Nikolai, which is like a Ukrainian name, and
Mhm.
some last name. He said it, immediately forgets it. It's like, shit, what is my name? And then but then they called it, and he was like, "Me." And he was like, I don't know how that happened. I just,
Wow.
but
Like
it's
some
like,
compulsion to like, oh my gosh, wow.
yeah. Um, yeah, you asked me how I came into mediumship. Anyway.
We're taking the scenic route, which I love because I'm like, this is all part of it, you know? It's
It
all
is,
part of it.
and I have one of those brains with like 12 tabs open at the same time. I can't, like, this is how my grandma talks too. Like, it's a disaster. You just have to sort of listen and just be like, okay, this is like an ASMR monologue that's like kind of really violent though. Like true crime, but like like different. I don't know. Um, but yeah, but I'm glad I told that story because I feel like it's kind of, it's in me, and it has to do with so much that's going on in the world right now, both in Ukraine and in Gaza and in different parts of the world, but particularly for me, those two places. But also like I think some psychic ability comes from like our ancestors having had to like do some shit.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I'm like floored that it just your grandfather's story is like a miracle after miracle, it feels like, like divine
Yeah.
intervention. Because man, I'm really blown away.
Yeah, he was like a really amazing guy. He only died like a few years ago. Oh yeah, it was 2021 that the class was. 'Cause do you remember that very first class you guys all got on the Zoom? And
Yes.
I was like, I am just back from the hospital. My grandpa just died 2 hours ago.
Yes.
Maybe you'll
Okay.
meet him.
Totally. Totally. And I also remember that while we were practicing doing, I think it was a gallery reading. I think Frank actually came through for me.
Oh,
And I remember that, like, I didn't know what the story was yet, or what your connection was. Because I think even in class you said, "Oh, he was a guy I used to work with."
Mm. I can't let it go. I'm like, oh yeah, it's my coworker, but can't catch a break still, you know.
And what I remember from that conversation, like the what was coming through, there was like I felt his humor. Like I felt his
Yes.
it was like a really um and it's weird because when you're first starting to learn this, you're kind of like, well, what does it mean to feel humor or to feel like the funnies, like whatever that funny feeling is. And
Hmm.
it's just it's like kind of you just feel like I don't know, I felt like I felt like laughing inside, there was just this like sort of like lightness,
He was really funny, and like it just one of those people that's like impossible not to love.
Mhm.
And I think like that's such an interesting thing with mediumship where I think people get really surprised by the actual process where it ends up feeling like an actual conversation and
Mhm.
so ground like like where we think about death and maybe like a couple different ways, but all of them are very serious and very
Mhm.
sort of I don't know, either too grounded or not grounded enough. Do you know what I mean? Like either
Mhm.
like, oh, I was by my mother as she was dying for a year every single day at the hospital, and you remember the smells and the nurses
Mhm.
and the doctors and sounds and whatever, and like it's so potent. Or it's like, oh, she's in heaven and like it's with the angels. She never sang a day in her fucking life, but now all of a sudden she's singing every day with these angels. Just these angels require her to sing and she likes it. Um, or there's nothing, and it's like what actually happens, and I don't know everything, but it's like all of it's happening at the same time,
Mm.
kind of, and like you tune in with people who've passed, and like they're just people, and they'll evolve and they'll behave differently in some ways, but like when my grandpa comes through, like people are like, "Well, like I didn't know him as a very serious guy because he was just like my grandpa, but like
Mhm.
people feel like the heaviness and the
Wow.
whatever, but like, and then, but also just how kind of clear he is and how he's like, okay, you do this and then you do this and then you do this because that's how he was. And, and with Frank, like I think, yeah, people, students, when he comes through, students are surprised by how he's just kind of like making fun of me,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, totally.
And it's like the sweetness of the relationship will come through. I don't just mean between me and him, but like through,
Yeah.
or sometimes like spirits will be sort of like, oh, I want to apologize, but I'm kind of nervous too, and it's the whole thing is just a lot more like mundane in a way and
Mhm.
less, I don't want to say less interesting, but just less esoteric than I think
Yeah.
people
Yeah. I
think
think
it
that's
is.
the perfect way of saying it. It's like you're talking to another human who just isn't necessarily embodied. It's like
Right.
it's just it's a person, it's a person with personality traits and things like that and an energy about them. And yeah, because I do remember, I remember him like, I don't remember exactly what came through the reading, but I do remember him sort of like, it felt like he was having a joke or like having a laugh, like,
Hmm.
and sort of poking fun, a little bit. And like everything felt almost kind of like a wink, there was like a wink behind it.
Totally. And that's how he was with it. I think that's why we got along so well, is because I think that's part of why we got along is because we had similar senses of humor, where
Mm,
everything's serious, but everything is also kind of funny,
yeah.
and he could be really sort of like awkward sometimes, but like charming in that as well, and really self-deprecating and really like, yeah, just a really good guy that and like,
I'm
yeah.
curious, like when he died, because I think there's something really powerful about this kind of grief that you're talking about. The sort of, I feel like people, the stories that you hear about people who um, got married and on the wedding day, one of the partners dies, like those types of stories where it's like, it feels like so much like the beginning, like so much at the beginning that there is this sort of, this an unwritten part of it that I'm curious, like how you grappled with that and what that experience was like, because I would imagine myself in your shoes feeling such like longing and almost this, I don't know, like a disquiet in a sense, like something that just can never be shut off.
Yeah, it was really confusing. I'm glad we're talking about this because I feel like it's been like I said almost 9 years, and I feel like in a lot of ways I'm just starting to unpack it now.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, because at the time there was so much like gaslighting around me, and a lot of people hadn't seen the two of us together, or if they had, they had kind of their own agenda. There's really
Hmm.
only one person um that we worked with who's a close friend of mine and was his as well, who shout out to Bets if you're listening. But who kind of witnessed us together. Or I think there were like a few people knew there was a flirtation going on. Like I think I'd heard things from other people, but I was just desperate to get validation. And
Hmm.
that was one of the feelings. I think it was for me like 49 different feelings at the same time, but one of them was feeling like, did that even happen? Did I make the whole thing up?
Hmm.
One thing that
Hmm.
really resonated with me at the time, because I was reading, like I started reading a book by Brene Brown because that was recommended to me. And I know people don't like her now. I'm not following, but she did help. The book helped me. I don't know what to say. Um, but it's that when someone dies, you lose the ability to co-remember. And so you're left being like the one person holding memory
Mm.
and
Well,
like the grief just in that. Because what I think about now is I'm like, oh, of course I was confused. Of course there was love. Like, of course it happened. Like the whole thing of like the beginning of a relationship or before a relationship starts, like with flirtation, the whole appeal of it, or not even appeal, but just the, what it is, the signature of it is like it's nebulous and it's
mhm.
um so much of flirtation, not that I know anything about flirtation, but um like truly, but just it's like, oh, did he or didn't he? It's
Yeah.
like you do things where you can also be like, oh no, I didn't mean it that way, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And
It's
yeah,
play. It's like almost it's playful because you're just sort of you're dancing together, and it's almost like you're not fully like glued yet,
yeah.
but there's a lot of like,
And it's
yeah.
intuitive
Mm-hmm.
and it's yeah, and before he died, like just a few days prior, and I wish I was making this up, but that was the day that I was like, oh, I love Frank
Mm.
because I was out with our friend Bets, and she said, I love Frank. I love him because he'd been struggling with some stuff, so we were talking about him. And I was like, you do? Because I was still just in complete denial. And then I realized I was like thinking about it. I was like walking to the bus, whatever, and I was like, oh, I love him. Like I love Frank.
Mm.
And then I think that was the weekend that I was starting to maybe understand that I had feelings for him. Because again, this was just like, I think one thing I've had to unpack, and one reason I didn't realize that I was kind of falling for him or that there were feelings was that it was so just different from any other romantic experience that I'd had before, where I wasn't like stalking him online because I was getting my needs met by this
Mm.
person. I knew that if I'd reach out to him, he'd respond back. I wasn't reaching out to him, but like it was, and
Like it wasn't toxic.
it
It
wasn't
wasn't.
toxic. It was, but
Mhm.
and again, not to get like too into it with him, like he did have his issues.
Mhm.
But even those, like, they weren't personal. Like it was
Mhm.
just, um, he made me feel good when I was around him, but not in a way that made it about me. It was just
Mm.
this sort of like rare understanding between two people that is really hard to explain and to name, but where like you touch someone and it just feels electric,
Yeah.
or you're next to someone and your nervous system is just like, oh, I'm safe. I
Mm-hmm.
just remember there was this guy I was freaking out about at the time, and no one else could put it in perspective to me. And he just said something very simple. Like he was just like, I told him about him, and he was like, "Oh, he was never interested. He just blah blah blah." Something about the way he said it just made me go, "Oh, okay."
Mm-hmm.
You know, and like the one thing that happened that I thought was just really sweet. This was like maybe a couple months before his passing, but um I we were at work. It was just the two of us, and what our work environment was kind of a living room. It sounds ideal. It was a fucking nightmare and for a lot of different reasons, but I was really delusional at the time. 27, 28, it's fine. Um, and I think I was on my period or had cramps or something, and I was like, Frank, I want chocolate. And I didn't think he'd actually go get me chocolate. I was just trying to be annoying.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, it needs to be 60% dark. I don't know why. I was literally just like, I just wanted to be annoying. That was the reason. And he's like, okay. And then he just like left the office to go get me chocolate. And I was like, is this for real? And then he came back and he awkwardly just handed me two different bars of chocolate because he's like, I couldn't find 60%. So I just got you two different bars. And I just took them. I was like, thanks. Like that. Like I was just like, okay. And I was like, oh, like I clocked it at in the moment. I'm like, oh, I can't ask him to do things for me because he'll actually do them. And I like don't want to drive like I don't want to torture this person. And like and then maybe a month or two later we were like at some uh store like at a grocery store for some reason. And we were in the chocolate aisle and he was looking and he was like, "Oh, there's the 60%. I'll come here next time." And I just my heart it was just so like I was like, "What is happening right now?" Like men don't do this kind of thing. Like just
It's so
remembering
endearing.
little things and like but not making it about himself or trying to like you know, like he wouldn't be like a TikToker being like,
Right.
"This is how you get women. You remember their
Right.
chocolate," you know? He was just
It's
very
not
low.
performative.
Exactly. Like
It's
he
just
wouldn't have
him.
told anyone about it's just that's who he was to like a lot of people.
Mm.
Um, you know, but like just kind of private about like these small acts of kindness that he would do. What was it? Why did I start talking about this? Oh, how did I feel that so after he died? Yeah, so it was
Yeah.
like those moments had been kind of like private and I hadn't told anybody, and I think he probably hadn't told anybody because I think like I didn't under so that had the way that things were developing, I didn't understand
Mhm.
that it was like a budding romance because it was just very different for me. I was preoccupied with other things. And so when he died, everything hit me all at once. I suddenly had this like dream about our child that obviously we didn't have, but like I was just looking for clues and I was in denial. Like, you know, it's like when someone dies so suddenly and so quick, like you just look for like, you know, oh, I gotta keep these clothes because like he might come back.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
I remember the very morning that he died, or that we found out he died because he was found. My boss called me, asked me where I was. I was like, "Oh, I'm still home," and she was like, "Frank is dead." So she said it, and I was forgot the story. I was wearing nail polish that I knew he didn't like,
Mhm.
because I would like I would do my own nails and I would paint them like a different color like every week or something. And I would like ask him like, "Do you like this color?" And he'd say yes, but this color he was like, "No, I don't like it." So it was like gray. Honestly, he was right. Um, and I just was such kind of like shock that I was like, oh, these are, I was like, oh, I'm wearing like chipped nail polish of this color that he doesn't like. I better take it off.
Wow.
And that was like the first thing I did was like I took my nail polish off and, um, because I was like, oh, he would not like that I'm wearing this when I'm finding out.
Mm.
And then yeah, like I went to work. We didn't work that day, but like just to kind of be together. And I think after that, I was just in this weird sort of limbo for a long time. Because I also started going to therapy maybe 5 or 6 months after that. And my therapist at the time, I didn't realize that she wasn't good, but
Mm.
she would kind of, I feel like just had this agenda for me that I would like snap out of it at some point, or that I would realize that like I didn't know him very well or something, or that we, or that like um she had her own ideas about like what addiction can look like and that it's only one thing. Um, and I just didn't really have a space to like process what had happened because it's just it feels really like kind of crazy
Mhm.
to grieve someone where you're also like, I wonder what their dick looked like, you know?
It's, you know, what you're describing is there's a term called disenfranchised grief, which is, you know, I think when people feel like the world is telling them or their community or whoever is telling them that they shouldn't be feeling this deep
Mm,
sadness or this loss as deeply as they are. And I think that's one part of it. But there's also this, you know, it's like when I'm hearing you share this, yes, it's like you're missing, you're grieving Frank himself, like the person and his energy and what his sweetness, his, you know, his just his essence, right? But then there's also you're grieving this like timeline, this future timeline, and like I keep on going back to the book metaphor because that's what I'm seeing in my head. It's like a like pages being just ripped out, you know,
yeah.
where there's like you could still see the letters, but it's like the whole page is gone, so you can't read it. But it's
Mm.
like there's you know that it was there, you know there was like something
It-
there before.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that because actually that therapist did call it disenfranchised grief, but I think because she didn't have like the metaphysical aspect and also honestly just was judgmental and had her own idea of things and was just like, what is wrong with you? Why aren't you dating type of thing? Not
Mm,
in so many words, but um, it's like it's undeniable to me that there was this other aspect of it of just like this is a really special person and we had something really special
mhm,
and that's rare. Um, and like, yeah, it's like grieving a future that didn't happen and just how crazy making that is
mhm.
and how like some people will acknowledge it and some people won't. And you're like, am I just walking alone with this?
Yeah.
And then like, I'd been like I'd considered myself like a pretty pragmatic person. So feeling stuff like other lives or other, like not really allowing myself to even like connect with him in this way of feeling like, oh, he feels the same way about me
Mhm, mhm.
because I just didn't want to be like a nut job,
Yeah.
um,
Like I'm creating this story that
because I want to hear, yeah.
right,
And
right.
no one had said to me that this is hard until like it was really just maybe 3 years ago, something like that. I'd been listening to like this podcast with the medium where she said one of the most difficult ways of losing somebody is like when someone's like the mistress or when it's like you'd just
Mm,
broken up or how you said like it was the wedding day. But I would say even beyond that, it's like just these nebulous relationships where it's like, let's say like you'd been together with someone for 10 years and then you break up and then a month later that person dies. It's like, where do you sit at the funeral? Like, you
yeah.
know, it's
Mhm,
like, um, where just even thinking like, 3 months later, 6 months later, if he had, and you have these horrible thoughts that don't make you feel good, where you feel even worse about having these thoughts. But
mhm.
if just, oh God, if it had been like 3 months later, if he had to die, if it had been later, like it would have looked different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
My experience of it would have been different. The way people talk to me wouldn't be
Mm-hmm.
like, "Oh, can you believe Frank died?" Where it's like they thought, or people at work, like
Yeah.
because they had no idea that we had something more, or people just want you to get over it, and it's like, or people will say like, well, it's good that nothing more happened because then you'd be even more upset or something. And it's just like, this is not how that works.
Yeah. I First of all, just thank you so much for sharing this story because it's making me feel like even if it weren't a death, like but it was um a relationship that for whatever reason had to end and
Mhm.
there's a deep deep connection there that is kind of not really displayed for the world to see or validated by
Yeah.
loved ones and community and workplaces and whatnot. Like I have a really special relationship with this person that, it's interesting because I'll have these scenarios play through my mind where I'm like, if this person died, would I go to the funeral? Like, would I go to the
Hmm.
memorial service? You know what I mean? Like, do I have a right? It's like almost the question is like, do I have a right to go? Because who am I? Even though in my heart I know how deep the connection is,
Hmm.
but it's just sort of like it's interesting, right? Where it's like the parameters that our society kind of puts on like what's valid and what's not valid
Yeah.
and it's a mind fuck.
It's a mind fuck. And I think like what's interesting is I'm seeing it from a even from another perspective now because I have a friend who is, I think, about 27 now, and she just went through something similar where someone she was like in love with passed away, and they were kind of just getting up, they were just almost getting started. It wasn't really acknowledged yet. They were in the flirtation phase, but it was like, I mean, and watching her go through it, also she's more mature than I was at the time, but no one should be mature.
Not at 27.
But um just how sad it is. Like, I understand the impulse now of people wanting to bypass it and and to be like, like, just really, they just really want you to have a boyfriend. Like, they just really want you to, it's like, it's a specific kind of sadness that's different than losing somebody that you had, like, a sexual or romantic relationship with that was established in some way. The fact
Yeah.
that it wasn't is so sad in such a different way, and people cannot handle it. And people are
Mm-hmm.
saying similar things to her as they did to me, or trying to like set her up with other people that are maybe similar to the guy.
Yeah.
And she's like, I'm not going to date one of his friends. What are you talking about? It's
Yeah.
like, because people just lose their minds. But like, people do not know how to handle this. And so you end up kind of going through it alone.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm like understanding that in a
Mm-hmm.
slightly different way. But it's so hard to hold, especially when you see like a young woman who's like, like cute or smart or kind of has things going for her. Talking about my friend, not me, but if you wanted to put that on me, that's fine too. I'll accept. But and you're just like you're like, I cannot deal, like it's hard to deal with it, like you're like but you have everything going for you. Like what's going
Mm-hmm.
on? And it's like, but that's not how it works. You
Yeah.
know? Um,
Your heart is connected to this other person, alive or dead. It doesn't matter. It's like the cord is there, like the energy is already there. And
yeah.
so I find it's really telling of, I think, our society where we're so pain averse and we're so like pain
Hmm.
phobic that
Hmm.
when we see another person who, at least on the outside, like from a, from an outside perspective, it seems like, well, this grief isn't like, they've been married for 20 years and they had 5 kids and, that kind of grief. This is like lighter grief, like it's almost kind of you impose that sort of that
Yeah,
judgment on it, or that sort of like measurement, or scale. And
totally.
yeah.
And you know what's interesting actually is that after his passing, I would say that the people who understood my grief the most were people who'd gone through. Like, I had a friend who actually met her after Frank's passing, but she had lost her fiance. And she did not judge me for 1 second, because of course there's a
Mm.
fear where you're like, I don't want to, like, I feel like a widow. Like, this feels crazy. Like, I can't explain how bad this feels. But I would never want to like say that to someone who's an actual widow or who lost like someone they were in like quote unquote an actual relationship with. Um, but those were the people who got it,
Mhm.
because grief is physical, and it's this thing that like if you're going through it, you're going through it, and it's not this like abstract like idea of something. It's like when people hear what you're going through like physically, they're like, oh yeah, that's what happened to me. My own grandmother didn't understand it until after my grandpa died. And then
Well,
she came to me for advice. This, by the way, this my grandma's story is not as heavy necessarily as my grandpa's, but it's still very heavy. She's been a refugee twice in her life. She lost her father very young. She was picking cotton in Uzbekistan as a child. Um, she's been through a lot. She has a tendency to be kind of like dismissive, in the way that people who've gone through a lot of trauma can be.
yeah.
But it was, yeah, I remember like after my grandpa died, she was like talking about Frank to me. Like she was like, "Oh, is this how it feels?" Like she was like, "Is this a trauma you're going to be carrying for the rest of your life?" And I remember saying that to my therapist at the time actually, and she's like, "Oh, that's what she said. She used the word trauma." And I'm like, "You're not using the word trauma, bitch. Like, aren't you supposed to be helping me?" But anyway, whatever. Can never miss an opportunity to like talk shit about somebody I don't like, but um yeah, I think it's like when you're experiencing something and other people are experiencing something physically, like that's really the thing of what it is. And we try to intellectualize, or it's like when people are like, well, but this is worse than this. It's like, but it doesn't matter. Like,
It doesn't matter.
it's
Yeah.
not like we're, grief makes you tired in this
Hmm.
way that in some ways is like a strange gift, because it just makes you unable to perform
Hmm. Hmm.
anymore, and you see someone else suffering, and I think like you can also be like, well, I'm jealous that they're suffering in this way and not in my way,
Hmm.
but because it doesn't make you into this better person or something, and
Yeah.
I've experienced that too in myself, but it also just makes you go like, oh fuck it, like I'm suffering, this person's suffering, like there's just like let's let go of just these like dividers and
Yeah.
this means this and that means that. It's like no, it's a horrific suffering that like we're trying to make meaning of, but ultimately doesn't necessarily have intrinsic meaning, you
Yeah.
know?
100%.
So that's how I became a medium. The end. Just kidding.
I am curious, like, did you start to, was it Frank's spirit that started to speak to you first? I mean, not first, but like kind of when you started to really be conscious of this gift.
This is a I'm still not even really sure what happened. Okay, so this is another fucked up part of the story that I don't even know how to talk about yet. But I was actually being scammed by a psychic after Frank's passing. Really juicy part of the story. Cannot make this shit up. And but at the same time, like I was like, I think I'd been suspecting. I don't remember what made me suspect that I might have psychic ability or what that even means, but it was like a little bit before he died,
Mhm.
if I remember that right. And then after he died, I feel like, yeah, like I was like, okay, I guess I'll start meditating. Like she was like, oh yeah, start meditating. She I think she was just giving me crumbs. Um, but yeah, there for sure are people out there who will take advantage of grieving people, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but and then it was like through I remember like meditating. That whole first year was a blur. First of all, let me just paint the picture of you of what things look like for me. I was living with my mother in New Jersey, taking the bus and the train to the Lower East Side to my AmeriCorps Vista job, um, that literally paid $12,000 a year, but was full time. And where my boss had been like previously was like, oh yeah, like I'll hook you up with this and this and this to like, so you can learn grant writing and whatever. And then that like never happened. And then she acted like she'd never offered it to me. So like I was in that hellhole, and like, but also like just too devastated to even be able to understand that like I was being scammed in this way by my boss. At the
Mm.
same time as being scammed by psychic. I was living at home. I was making no money. I had just turned 28, which my therapist now talks about as like, oh, that can be a time where people start to split off, or if you're feeling behind, you start to feel very behind when you're like in your late 20s if you haven't achieved whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to make sense of Frank's death in all of these ways that we were just talking about. And I really, really, really wanted at the same time to live a good life. Also, I was really mad at him for dying. I think I didn't say
Mm-hmm.
that part yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, you're not gonna keep ruining my life, Frank. Um, so I was really angry at him, even though I was also devastated and missed him so much and loved him. Um, and I was discovering all these really nice things that he did for people. So there was a whole side of him I was getting to know after his passing.
Mm.
And I think and I was sobbing every single day. And I was reading a lot. I was reading books. I was reading The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. I was
Mm.
reading books about grief because I was just trying to find myself somewhere. And through this, certain things started to happen. And they weren't even necessarily like that explainable or like when I say them, I think they might not sound so profound, but
Mm.
my experience of them at the time was like I this was real. Like I can't, like when I had the dream about our daughter, I woke up and I was like, that was our daughter. I was like,
Wow.
this is a daughter we would have had, but we didn't have.
Mm-hmm.
I started having dreams where I felt like dead people were talking to me. Where I just remember this like woman and we were like walking around a block and she was like talking about the apartment building to me. And I woke up and I was like, that was real. You can't tell me that wasn't real. At the same time, I was concerned because I knew that the that one of the symptoms of grief can feel like you can feel like you're in psychosis.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't I kept it as a possibility of like, oh, maybe I'm experiencing psychosis. I don't know. Let me just let this play out. I did start meditating and to not even meditation music because I didn't know what to do. And it was funny actually with the psychics because I was meditating and I would see these like masks in my third eye and they were like it looked because when you're learning psychic ability, as you know, it's like learning a new language. So
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know what it meant. It's not like I was like tuning in and suddenly it was like, oh, the psychic is scamming you. It
Mm-hmm.
was like I was closing my eyes, I would see these masks, and the masks were like, I think maybe I felt like, oh, someone's not who they say they are or something. But I didn't know what it was, and I went to her with it. And I was like, I'm seeing these masks when I'm meditating, and I think maybe somebody's not who they say they are. What do you think that means? And she was like, oh, I don't know. She's like, I really don't know. She's like, I'll tune into it later. I don't know. And and then and then a few things started to happen, like little synchronicities, just small ones. Like there was this podcast that I used to listen to like religiously, and it was just this comedian talking about whatever, right? And like the backlog of episodes was long.
Mm.
And I stopped listening right after he died. I stopped doing everything I'd been doing because it was too much. Whatever music I used to listen to, or podcasts, or books I was reading, I just stopped. I could not go back. And then several months later, maybe 5, 6 months later, I listened to this one episode of the podcast that I used to listen to, and the comedian mentioned, she was like, "Oh, I was just on a podcast um about mediums, so I got a mediumship reading." And I was like, "Oh, well, this is going to be a shit show, but let me listen to it." I was expecting it to be, I don't know what I was expecting. I was just like, "Okay, this will be dumb," but oh, well, let's see. And I listened, and I was like, "Oh, this is what mediumship can sound like."
Mm.
I have my issues with evidential mediumship, but that's what they were doing. And I was like, oh, the psychics are actually getting like specific information, and they're not like digging, and they're not trying to manipulate her. Like, it just was very clear that this is what psychic ability can actually be like.
Mm.
And they're having the conversation with the spirit person in real time instead of like reporting back later or something. Um, and then I became obsessed with that podcast. And then things started to I started to recognize myself and how the mediums talked about themselves, of always having had anxiety, but not understanding what that was, or having had certain experiences that they didn't know what to make of. And I was just suspecting, but I was taking my time and being slow. And then at one point, one of them was like, "Oh, I'm going to be teaching a class." And so I looked
Mm.
into that, and it's kind of like a roundabout, messy way of getting there, but like, or I was listening to this other, or I had a dream once of downloading. I used to listen to Pete Holmes's podcast. He's another comedian, and I hadn't in a while. And then I had a dream that I like downloaded one of the episodes, and then I woke up and I looked at like episodes, and one of them was by this guy. Oh my God, I'm forgetting his name right now, but anyway, I was like, oh, I think I need to listen to this one. And I did. And he described how to meditate.
Oh, wow.
And it was also like his documentary, or I guess like film that's sort of a documentary, is him kind of like tricking people into thinking that he's a guru. He's Indian. And then at the end of the movie, he reveals himself, but the point of it isn't to make fun of the people. It's to just kind of be like, look at how prevalent this is, but also like you've had
Mm-hmm.
everything inside you the whole time that you thought I was giving to you, right? Which was
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
a big lesson for me and a big part of kind of my spiritual awakening, I guess. Um, and and so yeah, it's like I was getting these like instructions in my dreams, and certain dreams were like so vivid that like there was one where I literally felt it. Like I was in the water, I was in a pool, and there were these like slimy fish, and I still remember the slime. Like it wasn't like a
Wow.
regular dream, and Frank was like leading me through the fish. And he was a very good teacher. He loved kids. He taught kids. So it's like in his way where he kind of like sometimes he was very funny, but he could also kind of like, if when he was serious, it was very funny because he would suddenly be so adult. Like
Mm-hmm. Switch
he'd
gears.
yeah, like I was trying to like joke around, and he was just ignoring the joking around. He was like, "Okay, now come here. Okay, now come," like just sort of steering me.
Wow.
And in this way where like I can still feel the fish, you know? Um yeah, and all this. So then I did take a class, and it was online, and it was fine. I think whatever class I ended up taking would have been the right one for me, because I needed to just see if I could do this. And then I remember um in the class we were supposed to just pair off with people and do readings for each other, and um I was I'd set up a reading exchange with this woman who was also taking the class, and she was in Australia. I don't, that's just a detail I remember. And on my way home to get on the Skype or whatever it was at the time, I said to Spirit in my head, I was like, okay, I've seen enough where I believe that this is real,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know if I'm supposed to be doing it. So if I am supposed to follow this, like if I'm supposed to be doing this, can you just make me do a reading where like I get a lot of evidence and where I really see that like I can do this and that this is real. And if I'm not supposed to do this, like don't show me anything and
Mm.
that's fine. And then I'll know and then I'll walk away. So, so this woman, like we get on the call and I was so nervous because I'd never done a reading before. I had no idea what I was doing, but I just sort of set the intention, like closed my eyes or something. I don't know. And at that point, I didn't know what psychic felt like versus what mediumship felt like. But I saw this woman's like whole house. Like I was getting stuff that was so specific that I was like, I remember little pieces of it, but I was like, you have only one vase in your house and it's shaped in like a triangle shape. I was like, there's
Wow.
someone who likes peeing on your flowers outside, and it's true, there was a dog. She's like, he comes every day. I was like, I know. Um, I was like, you have a tree in your backyard that reminds you of home. Because so it turned out she was in Australia, but she was from New Zealand, and the tree in her backyard is a tree that only grows in like New Zealand usually, or something like
Oh,
that. And and then I saw these like people come in. It was like a man and a woman, and I remember it being like, I was like, I'm seeing two things, and I was like, one of them is a rug, and I described what the rug looked like and the colors, and the rocking chair. And there was a lot more than that, but she told me after I'd sort of like come out of it, because I was like, oh my God, like, was any of that? Like, what was that? And she was like, my mother-in-law just died like 2 weeks ago, and we were just at her house, and I only took one thing from her house, and it was her rocking chair. And there was
wow.
one second thing that I almost took but didn't, and it was exactly as you described it, but she was like, it's not a rug, it's a blanket that she would keep under her feet. And it looks exactly how you described it. And that was really interesting to me. I'm putting in that detail because it made me go, oh, okay, this is real and I can do this. But it also made me go, oh, this is a communication. Like
Hmm.
something can be like a blanket and you as the medium can see it as as a rug
Hmm.
because it like took on the role of a rug
Right,
or
right.
however I'm saying that. But yeah, it functioned as a rug. Um, and it's being filtered through me and how I'm seeing it. Um, and then after that, I just got kind of like addicted to this. I think it was just in the time of my life where I was like, okay, I just really need like some purpose.
Hmm.
And it unfolded fast and powerfully for me, but it was also hard. The next few readings I did were really bad. I just didn't know what I was doing. So it just took a while to kind of like be consistently good. And
Hmm.
so, um, yeah, and I was just like obsessed with it, but in this way where I don't know that I was really healing, but it like, I don't usually like say this to people, but it, I think was what kept me alive, like I just needed something to just keep me from like, I don't think I really have it in me or had it in me to like take my own life, but it kept it like it was just like, okay, this is what I am. This is what I'm doing now. I'm gonna give up every other part of my life and I'm
Hmm.
just gonna do this.
There's something also about mediumship in that it opens you up to possibilities that you don't
Mhm.
perhaps allow yourself to entertain, if especially if you're not like, let's say, somebody who's been in this like spiritual path or, learning about a lot of this stuff. And so I find that at least for me, when you when I came to you for a reading and my dad came through, like, not surprising, I knew he was going to be the one to come through, but there was this feeling of just it's kind of that validation that you were talking about even
Mhm.
before with Frank, and feeling sort of like gaslit because it wasn't, the what you experienced with him wasn't validated. There's something validating about the connection to another person who's no longer embodied, you know?
Yeah.
that is so relieving, and it makes you feel like, okay, even though, yeah, it's like it makes you feel like you're not crazy. It makes you feel like I still have a
Mhm.
connection to this person that's unbroken, you know?
Yeah, and it, I think this goes back to something we were saying earlier about like the embodiment and the mundanity of it, where it's like I think sometimes when people talk about ancestors or spirit communication or mediumship, it sounds so abstract in a way
Yeah.
because they talk about it in terms of like culture or
Hmm.
which I think is also a valid way to talk about it. But when people only talk about it that way, I'm like, have you ever lost someone that made you feel like you lost a limb?
Hmm.
You know, like what about just these like when you're really when you're like alone and you're missing people or you're just having thoughts like are they really just about colonization? I
Right.
mean and maybe they are and of course I think for all of us in various ways it's like very present. But it's also just like when I think about like my grandpa, like I think about his hands,
Mm-hmm.
I think about like the way when I was a kid and he'd take me to Carvel and he was like really serious about money. So like the cashier would hand him like a nickel back and he'd take it. And it, like just the way that that exchange would happen and how ingrained in it like in my brain
Hmm.
that is, or the way he would like bend down and he would show me because I would see his bullet wound and the way he would like talk to me about it when I was a kid. He would tell the story that I told you, but like in this way that was like I was like, oh, because it was three, but like it was, but in this way that was a kind of for a child, and um, yeah, it's relational. It's
Hmm.
about it's like we don't live in this world alone. And it's not always about like I'm proud of you or I'm sorry, but that's a big part of it too. But it's like I don't know, like sometimes I think people come in for readings and I think everything is valid, although I also think that sometimes when people come in a certain way, there's something else underneath it, and I want them to look at that.
Hmm.
But some people will come in for a reading and they'll just think that the only purpose of it is like for their ancestors to tell them something really interesting, you know?
Hmm. Like something profound, like
Something profound,
groundbreaking.
something, yeah, like you're meant to be a star.
Right.
Um, And it's like, first of all, the ancestors are a goddamn mess, but we don't talk about that. But like so much of the time, isn't it like it's just feels sad to me when this doesn't isn't clear to people. It's like sometimes someone will just come through and they just like with Frank, it's like I just want to sit next to him. Like I would give
Yeah.
anything to just sit next to him quietly for a minute.
Hmm.
And like that's what mediumship has allowed me to do, where I've gotten to this place where I can feel my own people and communicate with my own people a little bit easier. I think sometimes it's easier to connect with others because you don't get in your own way so much. It's a little more removed.
Hmm.
But it's like, yeah, I think the magic of it is really kind of more mundane than people think or people want it to be. It's not always about evidence. It's not always about these profound insights. Sometimes it's just like, hey, like I loved being your kind of your dad, even though it's my grandpa, was kind of my dad. Um, or like your taste in chocolate is stupid. Like Frank has never said that, but just coming and making little. I remember one time, like um, I was um, I was holding a mediumship class at my old apartment, and that morning when I was like preparing, I thought of Frank and I like asked him to help the students, asked him to come in, and then I was like, I laughed because I remembered, I don't think I even knew this from him. I think I heard this from his sister or something, but where he used to call snakes danger noodles. And I and I just like had that thought. I just remembered it all of a sudden. And I was like, I just giggled, you know. I was like, haha, danger noodles. And and then I was holding the class and the student was connecting with Frank. She was like, he's showing me snakes. And I was like, uh-huh, what about the snakes? And they were like, I don't know. I think they were really thinking that there was something, because you know, sometimes when you see like, because
It's
it does have like
symbolic. Yeah.
symbolic, like it's,
Yeah.
you know, or
It's this
there's
deep
danger,
meaning.
whatever. And I was like, no, 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 pare it back. Like, don't put anything on top of it. Just be with the snake. Like, be with like what he's showing you. And it took them for like they just couldn't get it. And I was laughing so much. And then when I told them, they were like, "Oh." I was like, "That makes sense," because it was really this sort of like playful energy that he was coming through with. And I was like, "He's just trying to say that he heard me that morning. That's it."
That's so, yeah, it's shared space. You know what I mean? It's just like we're not gone. We're here. We're sharing the space still. We're sitting together still. Like
Yes.
I love that so much because that in itself is just comfort, you know? And I have a beautiful client who I got a chance to work with, and not through mediumship, but through like microdosing and grief work. And I was asking her, you know, what she liked to share with her husband, and they had like a ritual of like just having coffee together in the morning, you know. And I told her like, well, why don't you just do that still, you know, like have coffee with
Mhm.
him. And I think it's these little, like what you're talking about, the mundanity, like the mundane moments of like, you know, I would never call having coffee with my husband like a ritual, but it kind of is, you know, and it's like a
Hmm.
shared activity, but it's a mundane shared activity that's just like part of the fabric of your daily life, you know, your mundane daily life. And
Yeah.
those are the things I think that we tend to miss the most when somebody is gone, and sharing that space.
100%. And also the uncomfortable stuff, like what you're talking about, makes me think of too. It's like one thing that I had difficulty with after Frank died, because obviously I was getting a lot of mediumship readings, so I was in practice spaces. And a lot of people couldn't really like pick up on him very well or get him because I think the other thing that happens in these kinds of mediumship spaces that it's like, oh, it's all love and light and it's all, you know,
Mm-hmm.
they're good and you're good and like this is just a re-meeting and it was hard for people to pick up on what the relationship even was. Like, is this your brother? Is this like, no, he's my coworker. No, I think someone at once actually was like, oh, he's saying he worked with you. I'm like, God, like, are we? And then you're supposed to, as the receiver, for, because they're practicing, just say yes or no instead of being like, fuck you. Um,
Right.
and like, well, this part is embarrassing, but I'll share it anyway. But I have another student who is like we became friends over time. And she doesn't practice very much, but she's an excellent medium because she totally gives into the experience. She has acting experience, which actually helps because in acting school they make you just totally like forget yourself, which is actually so similar to like mediumship practice. And she was just like, "Oh, he's horny for you. Like he's jealous of other guys. Like he wants like he's like, babe, do you know what's going on over here with your bod, you know?" And I was kind of like, "Thank you," because I had felt something like that before from him, but I was like, that's cuckoo bananas. Like that's not possible. Like that's not what he's saying. I need an intervention, like someone else's, you know. And
Right.
other mediums, I think, are like afraid to pick up on stuff like that. So they're like,
Yeah.
oh, he just wants you to move on. Like he's, you know, and it's like, but in order to even get there, we have to go through the place where, yeah, like my friend was just like, yeah, he thinks you're like really hot and he's like upset that he can't make out with you. Like, you know.
I love this so much.
And I was like, thank you. Like someone needs like I've been going to the gym. Like no and like no one is looking at my like no one has seen my butt, you know, even though I've been working on it. It's just like, you know, so like you never know as it's so awkward because you don't really know as the medium what the person actually needs to hear or wants to hear. And then you
Totally.
just have to open yourself up to like you're kind of like the marriage counselor, but it's this conversation that you're like, this feels like this should be private, you know? And like
Like you're an interpreter for like some, yeah,
for
like
like a
really.
sex scene in a movie, like, you're like the intimacy coordinator on
Totally,
set,
totally.
and you're like, this is not, like when at first I was like, oh, I'm gonna help, like, it's gonna be so healing for people, and like they're gonna hear from their loved ones, and you're just sitting there like, yeah, like he thinks you're hot. That happened to me in a reading once where it was like the person I was, the person I was reading for, like his friend was coming through, and I was like, "Oh, you're dating a woman?" And he was like, "Oh, a non-binary person." And I was like, "Oh, like, but female presenting?" Because the guy in spirit was like, "Bro, she's hot," and like was showing me like the hip to waist ratio, like literally, and I was like, "I cannot say this out loud." He's just like, bro, like you like good job. Like she's so hot. Like her like she's a small waist and like a nice ass. And I'm just sitting there like, is she female presenting? Because he's just talking, and it was so uncomfortable. I don't remember what I said to him, but I was just like, this is not what I signed up for.
Well, I've always the one thing I admire most about you, aside from your gift as a medium, is just your humor. And like just
Thanks, Ellen. Someone
I, I
should.
s- it really, to me, it made the whole it like a night and day difference because, and I mean, I think my relationship with the mushrooms has shown me this time and
Mm,
time and time again. This universe, this world is fucking absurd.
so absurd.
It's absurd. And so I think when we bring our humor and kind of like, sometimes like the holiness, like the
Mm,
holiness that we have to like, feel like we have to regard death and like, I don't know, all this stuff with, spirit, whatever. It feels kind of religious trauma-y, but like
yeah.
it's so it doesn't honor the absurdity. It doesn't honor this like incredible like life force, which is just humor and comedy. So I'm like grateful to see you also stepping out as a comic too. Like I think that's
Yeah.
such a beautiful combination. Like
Thank you.
comedian, like I love that. That
It
is
was
like
like
the
so
most.
obvious all along, and then it's like, yeah. Sometimes I would like make jokes in classes and no one would laugh, and I'd still be like, whatever, guys, I'm hilarious. But the interesting point about that actually, like what that makes me think about is like my family, because they're really funny people, and everybody in my family has gone through like so much trauma. We touched on my grandpa, but like that's the most. But everyone in my family is funny. Everyone makes jokes about just the most horrific things. My grandfather, before he died, my uncle told this story where, like, when he was 95 and he was like, towards the end, he wanted to die. He was like, he wasn't
Ready.
eating. He was just like, I'm ready to go. Like, my mom would be like, oh, this person died. And my grandpa would be like, why not me? And, 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 but in the last like couple weeks before he actually passed, my because my mom and my uncle would be like like would make sure he recognized them, right? So they'd be like my uncle was like, "Who is this?" pointing to my mother, and my grandpa said her name. And then he points to himself and he's like, "And who am I?" And my grandpa, I think just trying to show that he was still in there, was like, "Oh, and you're the captain of the firing squad." And And it's just like, this like frail old man with this long history, but he's still just like cracking a joke like 2 weeks before he dies. And what I want to say about that is like, this is for especially people who feel like, okay, I want to get into this, but I don't know my lineage and I want to do this in like, an ancestral like way. Like, I don't want to appropriate or
Mm.
whatever. I mean, this is like a bigger conversation than this. Also boring appropriation at this point is kind of boring to me, but that's like another. But it's not. It is and it's not. Whatever. Can of worms. But I think what I want to say is like in one way or another, this work has been kind of stolen from all of us. And I'm not saying that in a way that tries to imply that it's like of course, with Native American people, or if we're, you know, talking about the US, like I'm not trying to say it's the same exact thing for all of us. I'm just saying all of us have lost lineages, like all of us have lost information, but
Mm-hmm.
it's in you. And like, what do you take from your family? Even if you hate them, even if you're adopted and you don't know them,
Mm-hmm.
even if, and I think like that's something that the ancestors just want us to know and to carry. Like, they don't know the answers either. They're like truly a fucking mess over there. And like, you know, as above, so below, I think was like a mistranslation where it's not like this happens here, so it happens here. It's like everything's happening at the same time type of thing.
Yeah.
And um yeah, I think the lightness and the humor and the like tuning in and just being like, oh, they're like cursing and they're making fun of me and I can like accept that is like an ancestral gift that I have. And if anybody's like listening to this being like, how can I do this? It's or like, how can I do this in a way that's respectful? It's like this work is not separate from life. It's not separate from what your experience is and what your family's experience is and how you cope and all of these things. So it's like just you can bring that in. It doesn't have to all look one way.
Mm-hmm. I so appreciate that. It's, I find that our relationship to death is the same way too. It's like it's reflected in our relationship to our life and our relationship to our ancestors or our loved ones on the other side. It's all so reflective of each other.
Mhm.
So I really, really, really appreciate that. And I'm just so grateful for this time and just this conversation. It's always a good time hanging out with you for sure. Like for me,
Me
on a
too.
selfish level, like I
No, I'm
love your
so
energy.
grateful too. When you asked me to do this and you were like, no worries if not, I was like, are you kidding? Like this is the best.
Well, I just am so grateful and thank you so much. And thank you for just being who you are. It like is truly
You're
like
welcome.
sunshine. Thank you all so much for tuning into this conversation with Nelly. One of the things I love most about Nelly is that she's also a comedian, and she has this really rad offering called Comediumship, which is a live show that combines stand-up comedy with audience readings, and it takes place in New York. So if you are local to New York, please check her out. You can go to her website, nellyreznik.com. That's reznik.com for information on comediumship, as well as her psychic development offering, which is a 6-week intuitive program that she's co-facilitating alongside another medium and psychic. And they're currently in the middle of their container for the fall of 2024, but there will be upcoming workshops in the future next year. So please visit her website and check it out and send her an email if you're interested or sign up for her mailing list if you want to be notified of future workshops. As always, these conversations are really intended for you to take them into your own personal spaces among your loved ones, your colleagues, your workplaces, your family, your friends. And so if there's something in here that really inspired you or a nugget that stayed with you, I just invite you to bring that conversation into those spaces and just continue the dialogue there. If you really got a lot out of this conversation, I just really honor and would love to have you leave a review and or a rating or a comment, something that helps us to really spread the word here. And like you, I would love to just be in deeper dialogue and conversation with the listeners of Mom. So please don't hesitate to leave a comment or to reach out. If you would like this podcast sent directly to your inbox, please subscribe to the Trip with Ellen Substack, and it will be delivered. Every episode will be delivered straight into your inbox. And also, we are on YouTube. So if you prefer to watch video, you can find us there. The link is going to be in the show notes. Thank y'all again so much for listening. I'll see you at the next episode.